Before it ruled the Pacific, it was a joke. When the first Grumman F6F Hellcat appeared in photographs, Japanese pilots laughed. Compared to the sleek, nimble Zero, this new American fighter looked absurd. Wide fuselage, blunt nose, oversized wings. They called it the fat cat that couldn't climb. To the Japanese, it was proof that America had forgotten how to build fighters. They were wrong. Because hidden inside that bulky frame was the most efficient killer of the Pacific War, a machine designed not for beauty, but for victory. In 1941, the U.S. Navy's main fighter was the F4F Wildcat. Brave, reliable, and utterly outclassed. When America entered the war, the Wildcat met the Zero over Wake Island and the Coral Sea. It was slower, less agile, and climbed like a drunk elephant compared to Japan's aerodynamic masterpiece. Pilots fought with courage, but courage doesn't outturn physics. The Navy knew it couldn't keep sending men into that sky with a handicap. They needed something new, something that could kill a Zero and live to tell the story. In 1942, Grumman Aircraft was given a simple but impossible order: build a replacement in 6 months. No prototype delays. No bureaucratic testing. It had to work the first time, or men would die. Leroy Grumman, a former Navy pilot himself, answered the call. He told his engineers one sentence that became legend: "Make it tough, make it fast, make it bring our boys home." The result wasn't elegant, but it was effective. The F6F Hellcat was born not from innovation alone, but from desperation and discipline. At the heart of the Hellcat was a beast, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. An 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. It was one of the most reliable power plants ever built. It didn't just move air, it bent it. The Hellcat could climb to 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes. Its wide nose housed a supercharger that gave it strength even in the thin air where the Zero gasped. Every piston, every bolt was a declaration. America would never lose a fight for lack of horsepower again. The Navy called Grumman the Iron Works. Their planes weren't art. They were armor with wings. The Hellcat followed that tradition. Self-sealing fuel tanks, bulletproof glass, armor plating behind the pilot, and thick aluminum skin that could take cannon hits and keep flying. Japanese pilots prided themselves on agility. Americans built for survival. The Hellcat's design philosophy was simple: take a punch, hit back harder, and make it home for dinner. It was less a fighter, more a floating fortress. And that's exactly what the Pacific needed. On June the 26th, 1942, test pilot Robert Hall took the first Hellcat prototype into the air. It roared like thunder, heavy but steady. By the time he landed, Grumman's engineers already knew they had something different. It wasn't graceful, it was dependable. Every adjustment made in testing was about pilot safety and durability. When Hall taxied the aircraft to a stop, he turned to the team and said, "It feels like a wildcat that went to war and came back angry." The Navy agreed and placed an order for 12,000 before a single combat mission. The Hellcat's first combat came in August 1943 over Marcus Island. Japanese lookouts watched the blue-painted planes approach and laughed again. They shouldn't have. Within minutes, F6Fs tore through Zero formations, scoring kills without a single loss. The pilots returned to their carriers with shock on their faces, not from fear, but disbelief. They'd just won their first fight with no casualties. The age of the Wildcat was over. The age of the Hellcat had begun. The Hellcat was fast, but it wasn't easy. Pilots had to unlearn old habits. The Wildcat fought by diving and escaping. The Hellcat could climb, roll, and strike with overwhelming firepower. 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each spitting 13 rounds a second. Tactics changed overnight. Pilots began to boom and zoom, using altitude and speed instead of turn fights. For the first time, the Americans controlled how the battle unfolded, and the Japanese didn't know how to respond. By 1944, the Pacific skies had changed color. The U.S. Navy's new carrier task forces unleashed hundreds of Hellcats at once. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they met Japan's best, over 400 Zeros, and destroyed them. It was so one-sided that American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On that day alone, Hellcats shot down more Japanese aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe lost at Stalingrad. The Zero, once untouchable, was now prey. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was a masterpiece of design for a different war. Built for range and agility, it lacked armor, self-sealing tanks, and modern control systems. Against early American fighters, that trade-off worked. Against the Hellcat, it was suicide. The F6F could dive faster, absorb damage, and climb while the Zero stalled. Japanese pilots found themselves trapped in a paradox. They could see the enemy, but couldn't catch him. Could hit him, but couldn't kill him. For the first time since 1937, Japan no longer ruled the air. When the Hellcat first met the Zero in real combat, pilots quickly discovered the secret: never turn with a Japanese fighter. The Hellcat could outdive, outclimb, and outgun, but not out-turn. The key was altitude. Start above, strike once, and climb away. A Zero could twist like a bird. The Hellcat could fall like a meteor. American pilots learned to fight vertically, not horizontally. Those who mastered that rule survived. Those who forgot it joined the ocean. By 1944, survival was no longer luck. It was design. The Hellcat's firepower was pure American excess. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, synchronized like an orchestra of thunder. Each burst fired 78 rounds a second. Tracer lines cut the sky like welding arcs, shredding wings and fuel tanks in an instant. Japanese pilots often described the first pass as a wall of fire. The Hellcat didn't need many hits. It only needed one clean burst. Every Zero it met carried the same fate: an aluminum coffin waiting to ignite. Behind every Hellcat victory was another weapon: the training pipeline. By 1944, American flight schools were graduating 2,000 pilots a month. Simulators, mock carrier decks, and combat films turned boys into tacticians. Meanwhile, Japan's elite aces were dying faster than they could be replaced. New recruits received less than 100 flight hours before combat, half what they'd had in 1941. The Hellcat didn't just beat planes, it beat a system that could no longer teach survival. While Japan hand-built its Zeros, America industrialized its Hellcats. At Grumman's Bethpage plant in Long Island, assembly lines ran 24 hours a day. Women in overalls riveted armor, students wired radios, and farmers' sons installed engines. Every 42 minutes, a completed Hellcat rolled off the line. Over 12,000 would be built before the war ended. Each one represented what Japan no longer had: oil, steel, and time. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was a fleet. It launched from Essex-class carriers that blanketed the Pacific like floating airfields. Each task force carried hundreds of F6Fs, ready to strike anywhere within 1,000 miles. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, had fewer carriers, less fuel, and almost no trained deck crews left. The Hellcat didn't fight from bases. It brought the base with it. And wherever it appeared, the Zero disappeared. June 1944. The largest carrier battle in history. Japan launched nearly 400 aircraft to defend its empire. Hellcats rose to meet them in perfect formation. The result was annihilation. By sunset, 300 Zeros and bombers were gone, many without scoring a single hit. American pilots joked they needed more fuel to find enough targets. Japanese officers called it the Taiho disaster. Historians remember it by another name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And at its heart flew the F6F. The Hellcat's strength wasn't just technical, it was psychological. American pilots knew they could survive hits that would vaporize other fighters. They climbed higher, attacked harder, and came home with bullet holes instead of body bags. Japanese survivors reported disbelief. Bullets went in, but the plane kept flying. That endurance broke morale as surely as machine guns broke wings. The fat cat had become an apex predator, and fear was its new weapon. By late 1944, Japan's desperation took a new form, the kamikaze. Pilots who once laughed at the Hellcat now flew to die against it. The Hellcat became the shield of the fleet, intercepting suicide planes before they reached the carriers. It wasn't a duel anymore, it was defense against extinction. In those final months, Hellcat pilots fought not for glory, but for every ship still afloat. They met courage with precision, and tragedy with fire. By Okinawa, the Hellcat had become both sword and shield of the Pacific. Every part of the Hellcat was designed for one purpose: to bring the pilot home. Its landing gear was overbuilt for carrier abuse. Its engine could run even with 2 cylinders shot out, and its structure could absorb 23 pounds of shrapnel before failing. Even when riddled with holes, the Hellcat's controls remained responsive. Many pilots returned with wings torn open or tails missing entirely. In aviation terms, the Hellcat wasn't graceful. It was immortal. For Japan, the numbers told the story. By 1944, for every Hellcat lost, 19 Zeros were destroyed. The legend of the invincible Zero had become a graveyard of aluminum. Fuel shortages, pilots' exhaustion, and obsolete tactics sealed its fate. The Hellcat didn't evolve. It replaced evolution itself. The Pacific skies had a new law. Whoever flew the F6F owned the day. And by the end of the war, nearly 5,000 Japanese aircraft had learned that truth the hard way. April 1945. Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. Every day, hundreds of kamikazes dived toward the American fleet. And every day, the Hellcats rose to meet them. The F6F became the first and last line of defense, intercepting suicide planes within seconds of their descent. In 1 week alone, Hellcat squadrons claimed over 100 kills. Pilots described it as hunting shadows made of fire. It wasn't glory anymore. It was grim mathematics. The sky had turned into a funeral pyre, and the Hellcat stood guard over every ship beneath it. Unlike the Zero, which turned tightly but bled energy fast, the Hellcat could climb, dive, and strike from anywhere in the vertical plane. Its engine allowed steep ascents without stalling, and its heavy frame made dives deadly. In air combat terms, it was the perfect energy fighter. Japanese aircraft entered dogfights light and agile. The Hellcat entered them like a falling hammer. Each pass was planned, cold, and merciless. It didn't dance, it ended dances. It wasn't the fastest plane in the world, but in combat, speed is less about numbers than about control. And the Hellcat controlled everything. The F6F wasn't just an airplane. It was a Navy culture. On carriers across the Pacific, sailors painted cat insignias on the fuselages, smiling, grinning, snarling cats wearing flight goggles. Hellcat Alley, they called the decks. Ground crews loved the machine. It was easy to repair, forgiving to land, and strong enough to survive even pilot mistakes. Mechanics said it had 9 lives, and it needed them all. Every sortie from a carrier deck over the Pacific meant betting your life on a strip of steel the size of a football field. The Hellcat made those odds bearable. Fighter pilots who flew the F6F described it with the same reverence soldiers used for lucky talismans. It was the airplane that forgave. It could slam onto a carrier deck in a crosswind, clip the barrier, and still fly again the next day. Other planes punished mistakes, said one pilot. The Hellcat saved you from them. That safety meant confidence, and confidence meant aggression. The Hellcat turned ordinary men into hunters, because they trusted their wings more than fear itself. Pacific combat wasn't just about skill, it was about stamina. Flights lasted 6 hours or more over endless ocean. Pilots fought exhaustion, dehydration, and the silence between attacks. The Hellcat's cockpit was roomy, its controls light, and its systems forgiving. Even after hours in the sun, it stayed stable. That mattered more than elegance. Because in a war fought over thousands of miles of ocean, the difference between a good plane and a great one was simple. Which one still flew when everything else fell apart? Captured Japanese reports reveal their disbelief. They called the Hellcat the iron whale of the sky. One pilot wrote, "Our bullets enter, but it keeps climbing." Another noted, "Its wings are thick like armor, and its engine roars even when hit." The psychological reversal was complete. Where once the Zero symbolized air superiority, it had become the hunted. Japanese formations broke at the sight of Hellcats diving from the sun. The laughter that had greeted the fat cat was gone, replaced by silence and smoke. The Hellcat didn't just win dogfights. It proved a nation's production could be a weapon. Grumman built over 12,000 in just 2 years, each interchangeable, standardized, and battle-ready. Japan's handmade Zeros couldn't keep pace with factories that never slept. This was war by mathematics. While Japan perfected craftsmanship, America perfected repetition. Every new Hellcat replaced a lost one before the sea could even cool around the wreck. It was industry versus artistry, and industry never missed a shift. No other fighter in history made as many aces as the Hellcat. 300 pilots achieved 5 or more kills in it. Names like David McCampbell, with 34 victories, became legends. He once shot down 9 planes in a single mission, an entire squadron erased before lunch. The Hellcat was the tool, but discipline was the edge. For every Zero that fell, a pattern emerged. The Hellcat always struck first, fired once, and left no second chance. Why did the Hellcat win? Not because it was faster. The Zero still had the edge in a flat turn. Not because it was more advanced. Its design was conservative, almost old-fashioned. It won because it matched technology with training, production with endurance, and simplicity with strength. It was the first true pilot's airplane, built for human imperfection. In a world of over-designed war machines, that humility became lethal. The Hellcat didn't conquer the Pacific through genius. It conquered it through understanding what pilots needed most: forgiveness. By the end of World War II, the F6F Hellcat destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft. Its kill-to-loss ratio, 19-1. No other fighter in history matched that record. It fought in every major Pacific engagement, from the Marshalls to Iwo Jima. When peace came, the Navy's logs were simple. The fat cat had ended an empire, and in its wake, Japan's proudest symbol, the Zero, had vanished into the sea. The laugh that once echoed through cockpits was gone forever. By 1945, Japan's Air Force was a shadow of its former self. Its factories were burning, its fuel reserves nearly gone, and its pilots half-trained. But the Hellcat never slowed. Carrier groups moved closer to the mainland, striking airfields, convoys, and training bases before they could launch a single plane. Every Zero lost was irreplaceable. Every Hellcat lost was replaced before dawn. The Pacific had become a one-sided chessboard, and every move Japan made ended in smoke. Victory was no longer in question, only the endurance of those still flying. As the war dragged on, Japanese pilots began describing the sky itself as smaller. Radar-equipped carriers, long-range patrols, and Hellcat escorts blanketed every route from Formosa to Tokyo. There was no safe airspace, no room left to climb or hide. The Zero, designed for open duels, now fought inside a cage. American pilots patrolled in pairs, then in swarms, striking from every altitude. What had once been an empire of the rising sun had become an empire of contrails, and every line pointed down. Back in Long Island, Grumman aircraft operated like a military base of its own. Welders, engineers, and machinists worked in shifts around the clock. Children collected scrap aluminum, knowing it might become part of a wing. Grumman engineers slept beside the assembly lines, adjusting tools by hand. When one batch of engines failed inspection, the entire management team stayed overnight until every fault was fixed. The motto on the wall read, "We build them to bring them back." And they did. Thousands of pilots owed their lives to that promise. Hellcat pilots entered battle with something Japan could no longer give its men: training hours. By mid-1944, American aviators averaged 350 hours before combat. Their Japanese counterparts barely reached 100. That difference wasn't measured in minutes, it was measured in survival. Hellcat aces said they felt the shift instantly. "We fought professionals at Midway," one recalled. "By the Marianas, we fought students." The Pacific was no longer a duel. It was a graduation ceremony, and the Hellcat was the final exam. By the time U.S. carriers approached Japan, the once mighty Zero was little more than a ghost. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Synthetic gasoline crippled engine performance. The Hellcat flew higher, faster, and longer, striking airfields from Kyushu to Honshu. Japanese radar picked up the incoming raids, but could do little more than watch. For every hero that took off, 10 Hellcats waited in the clouds. The fat cat had grown into a predator too large to escape. It didn't hunt anymore, it harvested. One of the last true air duels between a Zero and a Hellcat took place near Tokyo Bay in May 1945. Lieutenant Robert Burnell of VF-31 engaged a veteran Japanese ace at 12,000 feet. For 5 minutes, the two circled, climbed, and dove. Burnell resisted the urge to turn tight. He waited. Then, when the Zero stalled mid-climb, the Hellcat rolled inverted, fired a single burst, and the sky erupted. Later he wrote, "He outturned me every time, but I outlasted him once. That's all it takes." That sentence became the doctrine of the Pacific. The Hellcat fought not only aircraft, but fatigue. Long missions meant constant danger from weather, navigation errors, and fuel starvation. Many pilots were lost not to bullets, but to empty tanks over endless water. The F6F's range, 1,500 miles with drop tanks, gave them a chance. But every pilot knew the Pacific could turn from ally to grave in minutes. The real enemy wasn't always visible, sometimes it was the horizon itself. While most remember the great carrier battles, the Hellcat also served in lesser-known operations. In Burma, it supported British ground troops. In the Atlantic, a handful of Hellcats hunted U-boats. From French into China to the Philippines, it provided close air support for advancing armies. Wherever it flew, it brought the same rule: dominance through reliability. It wasn't built for any one theater. It was built to end wars wherever they hid. In the final weeks of the war, Japan launched its last reserve, the Kika jet and the Shinden interceptor. Both were rushed, untested, and too few. Against radar-directed Hellcats and Corsairs, they barely left the runway. The empire that had once revolutionized aerial warfare had run out of engineers, metal, and fuel. Meanwhile, the Hellcat, rugged, analog, dependable, still roared across the sky. The lesson was brutal and simple. Technology without time is tragedy. The Hellcat was never meant to be perfect. It was heavy, it dragged air, and its frame shuddered in steep dives. But perfection doesn't win wars. Endurance does. Its imperfections made it forgiving, and forgiveness made it deadly. In every battle from the Gilberts to Okinawa, the Fat Cat proved that survivability is a weapon. It outlasted its rivals, its critics, and the empire that mocked it. The Hellcat didn't just avenge the Wildcat, it avenged every pilot who fell before it. August 1945. For the first time in nearly 4 years, the Pacific sky went quiet. No contrails, no intercepts, no smoke. Hellcats still circled above the carriers, but there was nothing left to fight. Japan had surrendered. Pilots who had flown hundreds of sorties stared at the horizon, unsure how to stop listening for danger. Some cried. Others simply taxied, shut down the engines, and sat in silence. The laughter that once mocked the Fat Cat had faded into the wind. Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like relief. By the war's end, the Hellcat's record was undeniable. 12,300 built. 19-to-1 kill ratio. 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. But those numbers came with another figure. 300 pilots lost. Even in a war of machines, the cost was still human. Each victory was written in fuel, sweat, and names engraved on carrier walls. The Hellcat didn't win through invincibility. It won because men kept climbing into it, knowing what it cost, and doing it anyway. After the war, thousands of Hellcats were mothballed, scrapped, or sold for pennies. But a few survived. Some flew in the reserves, others in test squadrons. A handful became movie props. Yet, for every pilot who touched its stick, it remained sacred. Veterans said flying the Hellcat again was like meeting an old friend who once saved your life. It didn't just serve, it endured. And that endurance became legend. Grumman wasn't finished. The lessons of the F6F became the foundation for the F8F Bearcat, a smaller, faster, more agile fighter built on the same philosophy. Power first, protection always. Though it arrived too late for World War II, the Bearcat would train a new generation of pilots who'd soon fly jets. The Hellcat's DNA lived on in every Grumman aircraft that followed, from the F9F Panther in Korea to the F-14 Tomcat decades later. The company that built the Fat Cat had found its destiny, creating planes that brought their pilots home. The Zero began as a masterpiece and died as a monument to inflexibility. It proved that brilliance without adaptation is suicide. Japanese engineers designed perfection for 1939. They never built for 1945. The Hellcat, imperfect and industrial, evolved faster than Japan could rebuild. In the end, the Zero's death was not from bullets. It was from the passage of time. The war taught a cruel truth. Innovation means nothing without endurance. In post-war interviews, Japanese aces spoke with unexpected respect. One said, "The Hellcat was not a plane. It was a fortress that flew like a hawk." Another added, "We laughed at it. Then we learned what real engineering looks like." American pilots, too, gave credit where it was due. They admired the Zero's elegance, its grace, its daring. But they all agreed on one thing. If you wanted to live through the war, you flew a Hellcat. Everything else was a gamble. Historians later analyzed the data. The Hellcat's success wasn't luck. It was logistics. Radar guidance, pilot rotation, fuel reserves, and maintenance support all combined into one machine of war. The F6F was the blade, but the carrier fleet was the arm that swung it. Each sortie involved hundreds of people: mechanics, signalers, meteorologists, ordnance crews. It wasn't a duel between pilots. It was a duel between systems. And America's system never slept. Every Hellcat shared the same serial precision. Rivets aligned to millimeters, engines interchangeable between aircraft. That meant something unheard of in war: predictability. A pilot landing on one carrier could take off the next morning in a completely different plane, and it would feel exactly the same. That consistency gave the Navy confidence no other nation had. Germany built wonders, Japan built dreams, America built reliability, and in the end, reliability won the skies. When peace returned, many Hellcat pilots found it hard to adjust. After years of steel decks and thunder, the quiet of civilian life felt alien. Some became commercial pilots. Others joined the new U.S. Air Force. A few kept flying for sport, always favoring aircraft that forgave mistakes. The Hellcat had taught them a philosophy that reached beyond war: that survival isn't luck, it's preparation, and preparation never goes out of style. In Japan, few Zero pilots survived to see the end. Those who did carried guilt more than pride. They had flown with honor, but for a cause already lost. One veteran, interviewed in 1968, said quietly, "We thought we fought men. We were fighting factories." His words defined the Pacific War in one sentence. The Hellcat was proof that machines can outlast courage, and sometimes that's what victory requires. Every Hellcat was only as good as the man inside it. It offered protection, but demanded patience. It gave power, but punished arrogance. Pilots who respected its weight learned to master it. Those who fought it didn't last long. In that way, it mirrored the war itself, requiring balance between aggression and endurance. The Fat Cat didn't win because it was better than the Zero. It won because its pilots learned humility faster than their enemies did. Today, one can still find both planes in museums. The fragile frame of a Zero beside the armored bulk of a Hellcat. Side by side, they tell a story written in contrast. One about brilliance without margin, the other about margin turned into mastery. The Zero whispers what might have been. The Hellcat hums what actually was. Both are beautiful, but only one brought its pilots home. The Hellcat's lesson went beyond the Pacific. It redefined what superiority meant. No longer the lightest, fastest, or flashiest plane would rule the sky, but the one that stayed alive the longest. Survivability became doctrine. Future jets would be judged not by how fast they flew, but by how much punishment they could take and still fight. That philosophy began with a plane everyone once mocked. It began with the Fat Cat. Every year at air shows, when the last remaining Hellcats start their engines, a distinct rumble fills the air, deep, resonant, like thunder remembering its shape. Veterans stand silently, eyes wet, as the fat cat roars one more time. You can almost hear history in its pistons, the sound of a machine that turned mockery into dominance. For a few seconds, the Pacific lives again, and the sky remembers who owned it. In the end, the F6F Hellcat was more than a fighter. It was proof that strength isn't always sleek, and survival isn't always graceful. It began as a joke and ended as judgment. The Zero gave Japan its glory. The Hellcat gave America its revenge. 5,000 enemy planes fell, and with them, the empire that once laughed at the fat cat. Today, its silhouette stands for something larger than war, the quiet power of resilience, of industry, and of men who trusted the machine that trusted them back. The war ended. The Hellcat didn't. It simply landed, victorious. Long after the war, fishermen across the Pacific reported strange shapes below their nets. Wings of rust, fragments of blue paint, and engines tangled in coral. They were the bones of a vanished empire, the Zeros that once ruled the sky. Diving teams who found them sometimes found another shape nearby. A Hellcat. Two enemies locked together on the ocean floor, silent as the day they fell. The Pacific had become a museum without walls, its exhibits written in metal. Every wreck told the same story. The sky remembers who owned it last. The Hellcat's legacy didn't stop in 1945. Its design principles shaped the jet age. When the F9F Panther and later the F-14 Tomcat entered service, engineers still quoted the old Grumman motto: "Make it tough, make it fast, make it bring them back." Even in the age of missiles and supersonic speeds, survivability remained sacred. The lessons learned from the Fat Cat were engraved in every aircraft schematic. Structure first, systems second, speed third. In that sense, the Hellcat still flies, just with new engines. Behind every Hellcat was an army without uniforms, welders, mechanics, women on factory floors. They were called Rosie's Sisters, the Invisible Squadron. They worked 12-hour shifts under floodlights, hands blistered, eyes strained, building wings that would never return. When the war ended, they disappeared quietly back into civilian life, their names unrecorded. But every Hellcat that brought a pilot home carried their fingerprints in the rivets. They never fired a bullet, but they won the same war, one rivet at a time. Modern pilots who fly jets like the FA-18 Hornet study the Hellcat's combat reports. Not for tactics, but for philosophy. They learn that combat isn't only about speed, it's about control, teamwork, and the ability to recover when everything fails. Simulators replay those lessons through digital cockpits. Every time a young aviator survives a stall, dodges a missile, or lands on a pitching carrier deck, he's echoing the Hellcat's greatest truth. Machines save lives only when built for human error. In museums today, tourists stare at the bulky frame of the Hellcat and ask how something so heavy ever ruled the air. The answer lies not in numbers, but in intention. It was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to endure. It was the fighter that outlasted the perfect one. And somewhere between those two extremes, between grace and grit, lies the real story of the Pacific. A story not of perfection, but of persistence. Because in war, the last plane still flying decides what history remembers. Decades later, surviving Hellcat and Zero pilots met at a veterans reunion in California. They shook hands, some for the first time, others through tears. One Japanese veteran said softly to an American, "You were the better pilot." The American smiled and replied, "No, I just had the better cat." The room laughed, but quietly, reverently. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was closure. Two old enemies, bound forever by the same sky. When the last operational Hellcat fires its engine, the sound is something between thunder and heartbeat. It's the same sound that once echoed over Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, now echoing through history. The veterans say it's not noise, it's memory, because every rotation of that propeller still whispers a single truth. They laughed at the fat cat. It laughed last. When the war ended, silence fell across the Pacific. The same skies that once roared with engines and tracer fire now held only clouds and wind. On carrier decks, Hellcats sat lined in rows, wings folded, their paint sun-faded and scarred. Pilots who had survived hundreds of missions stood beside them, uncertain what to feel. Victory didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like the absence of noise. For the first time in years, the fat cat slept, and the world beneath it exhaled. At Grumman's Long Island plant, the assembly lines that once built 42 Hellcats a day went quiet. Welders and machinists who had worked through the nights were sent home. But the company refused to die with the war. Instead, it evolved, redesigning its machines for a new age of jet propulsion. The same engineers who riveted aluminum for war now forged the wings of peace. Grumman had learned that the strength of a nation wasn't in its weapons. It was in its ability to adapt faster than its enemies could recover. In the years that followed, Hellcats found strange new lives. Some became training aircraft, others raced at Reno, stripped of armor, but not of soul. A few patrolled coastlines for the Navy Reserve, guarding the same ocean they once ruled. One even served as a flying camera platform for early Hollywood films. The warbird that had brought destruction became a tool for creation. And in that irony, perhaps, the Hellcat found its final mission: to remind humanity what power could do when guided by restraint. When the jet revolution began, engineers didn't start from scratch. They started from the Hellcat. Its wide frame, high visibility cockpit, and simple control layout became the blueprint for safety in the new supersonic era. The F-9F Panther, the Navy's first successful jet, was often called a Hellcat with a jet engine. Even in a new world of speed and science, the Fat Cat's fingerprints were everywhere. It had taught aviation one rule that never changed: survival is the foundation of innovation. For the men who flew the Hellcat, peace was never truly quiet. They carried the sound of engines in their sleep, the smell of fuel in their hands. Some avoided air shows. Others built model planes to remember. When asked about their time in the Pacific, most simply said, "We did our job." Because how do you explain what it means to survive in a machine that shouldn't have? The laughter of the past had burned away, replaced by a silence heavy with memory. The Navy never forgot the Hellcat's lesson. Every Grumman fighter that followed, Bearcat, Panther, Cougar, Tiger, Tomcat, carried the same soul. They were all tough, overbuilt, and built to bring their pilots home. Sailors joked that if Grumman built a ship, it would float even upside down. From propellers to jets, the Cats became a lineage of survival. The Hellcat was their ancestor, the first beast that taught the fleet how to endure the sky. To this day, debates rage among historians. Which was better, the Hellcat or the Corsair? The Corsair was faster, more elegant, with its signature gull wings, but it was also harder to fly, less forgiving on carrier decks. The Hellcat was slower, but safer. When measured not by speed, but by survival, The numbers tell the truth. More kills, fewer losses, more pilots home. In the Pacific, the Corsair may have been the star, but the Hellcat was the backbone. And wars aren't won by stars. They're won by what lasts. Make it tough, make it fast, make it bring them back. That motto, carved on a wooden plaque at Grumman's headquarters, became the creed of modern naval aviation.